There are two kinds of danger in Harlem. The kind that announces itself with shouting, sirens, and gunfire, and the kind that pours you a drink, calls you brother, and waits for you to lower your guard. Bumpy Johnson survived the first kind his entire life. It was the second kind that nearly ended him. By the mid-1940s, Bumpy had already outlived men who carried bigger guns, louder reputations, and far less patience. Harlem didn't respect him because he was violent. Harlem respected him because he was precise. He remembered favors. He remembered insults. And most importantly, he remembered patterns. When something felt off, it usually was, and by the time others noticed, it was already too late. This story begins on a night that was supposed to be routine. A closed-door meeting. Familiar faces. Old alliances. A room filled with men who had eaten together, made money together, and sworn loyalty more times than they could count. No one walked in expecting chaos. No one expected blood. That's exactly why the trap was so dangerous. Because betrayal doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives calm, controlled, convincing. It arrives wearing trust like a tailored suit. And on this night, the person closest to Bumpy believed that trust could be converted into cash. $30,000 to be exact. Enough to change a life. Enough, he thought, to end one. What happened next was not a shootout. It wasn't a brawl. It wasn't even revenge in the way most people understand it. It was something colder. Something far more instructive. A moment where power didn't explode. It settled. And by the time the night was over, Harlem learned a lesson it would never forget. You can try to sell out a king, but the price is never what you think it is. Every city has a few rooms where reputations are tested without warning. In Harlem, one of those rooms sat behind velvet curtains and polished brass, hidden from the music and laughter out front at Small's Paradise. To most people, it was just another back room. Dim lights, cigar smoke, the low murmur of men talking business. To the people who mattered, it was a scale. You walked in, and the room quietly weighed you. Not by what you said, but by how you moved, where you sat, and how comfortable you looked doing nothing at all. On this night, the room was full long before the meeting officially began. Chairs were pulled back a little too carefully. Jackets stayed buttoned. Nobody laughed too loud. The kind of tension that doesn't come from fear, but from calculation. Men here weren't worried about violence. They were worried about consequences. In Harlem, violence was easy. What followed, violence was not. When Bumpy Johnson stepped inside, nothing changed on the surface. No sudden silence, no dramatic pause. Just a few glances that lasted half a second longer than usual. Bumpy noticed all of them. He always did. He had learned years earlier that the fastest way to understand a room was not to speak to it, but to let it speak to you. He took his seat without ceremony, neither early nor late. That mattered. Being early suggested eagerness. Being late suggested dominance. Tonight required neither. Around the table sat men who claimed to represent business interests, but Bumpy knew better. Some represented numbers operations. Some represented police pressure. Some represented Italian ambition that had been circling Harlem for years, looking for a weak seam. And one man represented something far more dangerous: familiarity. The meeting had been framed as practical: borders, cooperation, future arrangements, words that sounded clean but never were. Harlem was profitable, disciplined, and, most importantly, controlled. Outsiders didn't like that. They mistook order for opportunity. They mistook calm for softness. And they believed that if Harlem could not be taken by force, it could be opened from the inside. As the discussion drifted from formalities into suggestion, Bumpy said very little. He listened. He watched who spoke too confidently and who avoided eye contact. He noticed who deferred and who pretended not to. Most of all, he noticed who tried too hard to make the night feel ordinary. In Bumpy's world, effort was a signal. Comfort was earned, not performed. Drinks were poured, not as a celebration but as punctuation, a way to mark the moment when talk stopped and intent began. Glassware touched the table softly, one by one. No toast, yet. No smiles wide enough to be real. This was the point where decisions hardened, where paths narrowed. The room thought it was hosting a negotiation. In reality, it was hosting an examination. And the men who believed they were here to judge Harlem had already failed the first test. Because the most important rule of that room was simple. If you think you control the situation, you probably don't. And if you're too comfortable proving it, someone else already has. Betrayal almost never begins with hatred. It begins with arithmetic. Numbers that line up too neatly. Risks that seem manageable. Justifications that feel reasonable if you don't say them out loud. The man, closest to Bumpy, didn't wake up that morning thinking of himself as a traitor. He woke up thinking about pressure, about ceilings he'd hit, about how long he'd been standing in someone else's shadow. Familiarity has a way of turning gratitude into resentment, and resentment into opportunity. The offer wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with threats or ultimatums. That's not how serious deals are made. It came quietly, wrapped in reassurance. No blood, no noise. Just a clean solution to a stubborn problem. One drink. One moment. One payment that would erase years of struggle and rewrite the future in a single night. $30,000 was more than money. It was validation. Proof that his access mattered. Proof that he wasn't just another piece on Bumpy's board. What made the proposition dangerous wasn't the poison or the plan. It was how believable it sounded. The Italians didn't insult Harlem by suggesting force. They acknowledged its strength and worked around it. They treated the betrayal like a professional courtesy. No disrespect, no spectacle. Just business conducted through someone who knew the habits, preferences, and rhythms of the man they couldn't reach directly. And that's what made the choice feel safe. Too safe. Because loyalty, once tested, doesn't snap all at once. It stretches. It bends under small compromises. A meeting that shouldn't have happened. A favor that asked too many questions. A payment explained as insurance rather than payment. Each step felt survivable. Each step made the next one easier. By the time the final decision arrived, it no longer felt like a line being crossed. It felt like a path already walked. Inside the room, the betrayer played his role carefully, too carefully. He remembered what Bumpy liked. He anticipated needs before they were voiced. He tried to control the pace of the night, guiding it gently toward the moment he believed would end everything. That kind of attentiveness usually reads as respect. In this case, it read as effort. And effort is what people notice when something is wrong. The others in the room didn't see a traitor. They saw a facilitator. Someone smoothing edges, keeping things calm, making sure no one felt cornered. To them, that was professionalism. To Bumpy, it was imbalance. Trust doesn't rush. It doesn't insist. It doesn't lean forward hoping to be believed. What the betrayer didn't understand was that Bumpy measured loyalty differently than most men. Not by words or history, but by consistency under pressure. People show you who they are when they think the outcome is already decided. And in that room, someone was behaving like the ending had been agreed upon in advance. The deal had already been made, the payment promised, the method settled. All that remained was execution. But the most dangerous part of any betrayal is not the act itself, it's the assumption that the other side is unaware. Because the moment that assumption fails, everything changes. And in that room, it already had. Bumpy didn't experience suspicion the way other men did. There was no sudden flash of danger, no internal alarm. What he felt was absence, the absence of randomness. Too many things were aligned, too many gestures landed exactly where they were meant to. Nights like this were usually messy. Someone talked too much. Someone drank too fast. Someone pushed when they shouldn't. Tonight, everything moved smoothly, as if rehearsed. That was the first sign. The second sign was timing. Offers were framed as inevitable instead of negotiable. The future was discussed as if resistance had already been removed from the equation. Men who were supposed to be persuading him spoke like men waiting for confirmation. And the person closest to him kept redirecting the room, gently but persistently, away from uncertainty and toward closure. Bumpy didn't interrupt. He never did when information was still flowing. He let the conversation breathe, let people get comfortable with their own assumptions. Comfort makes men careless. Carelessness creates patterns, and patterns tell the truth faster than confessions ever could. He noticed the pauses between exchanges, who waited to speak, who didn't need to. He noticed the way certain eyes drifted toward the same corner of the room when silence stretched too long. He noticed how the tone shifted whenever finality crept into the discussion. A subtle tightening, like men bracing for something they believed was already underway. At some point, the meeting stopped being about territory or cooperation. It became about timing, about when something irreversible would happen. Bumpy felt that shift clearly. It was the same feeling he'd had years earlier, right before violence broke out. Except this time, the violence had been replaced by confidence. That confidence didn't belong to him, and that was the mistake. Bumpy had learned long ago that real power never assumes the ending. It prepares for multiple versions of it. Anyone who walks into a room believing the outcome is guaranteed has already exposed themselves. They start moving faster, talking cleaner, trying to manage details instead of reading the room. That's when Bumpy understood. The trap wasn't waiting to close. It had already closed, just not around him. He didn't need proof yet. Proof was coming. What he needed was time. Time to let the room continue believing in its version of events. Time to allow the betrayer to lean further into the role he thought he was playing. Time to let everyone else commit mentally to a future that would never arrive. So Bumpy did what he always did when he had the advantage. He slowed everything down. He asked questions that didn't need answers. He let silence stretch a few seconds longer than normal. He shifted the rhythm just enough to force people to react instead of perform. Small disruptions, controlled ones. The kind that make liars overcorrect and honest men stay still. And then it happened. The smallest crack. Barely visible unless you were looking for it. A glance held too long. A hand that hesitated before resting on the table. A breath taken at the wrong moment. To anyone else, it would have meant nothing. To Bumpy, it was confirmation. From that point on, the meeting was no longer dangerous. It was settled. The room just didn't know it yet. Once the truth was clear, Bumpy stopped thinking about survival. Survival is reactive. What mattered now was positioning. In Harlem, killing a problem was easy. Ending it without consequences required something else entirely. The men across the table still believed the night could be controlled with force if needed. That belief was useful, as long as it stayed theoretical. Bumpy didn't confront anyone immediately. Direct confrontation would have collapsed the structure too soon. Instead, he let the tension thicken. Let the weight of unspoken certainty press down on the room. Men began adjusting in their seats. Jackets shifted. Eyes tracked movement that wasn't there. The sense that something had gone wrong crept in, not as panic, but as doubt. Doubt spreads quietly, and once it does, authority begins to leak. This was the moment when lesser men reached for weapons. Bumpy reached for context. He reminded the room, without saying it outright, where they were. Harlem wasn't neutral ground. It wasn't disputed territory. It was governed by memory and response. Every action taken inside it echoed outward, into storefronts, stairwells, churches, numbers houses. Violence here didn't end arguments, it multiplied them. And everyone at that table knew it. The men representing outside interests hesitated, not because they were afraid of Bumpy, but because they understood the geometry of the situation. One wrong move would not end the night. It would start something that could not be negotiated back into silence. Power, when used clumsily, invites witnesses. Harlem never lacked witnesses. That's when names started to matter. Not shouted, not threatened, simply acknowledged. The kind of names that remind people where disputes actually get resolved. When Lucky Luciano existed as a reference point, it changed the temperature of any room. Not because he was present, but because he represented structure, order, consequence. No one wanted to explain unnecessary chaos to the man who had built a system specifically to avoid it. Bumpy didn't need to say much. He didn't need to posture. He framed the situation as a choice, not a challenge. Choices allow people to retreat without humiliation. Challenges force them to respond. Bumpy understood that men fight hardest when they feel cornered. So, he didn't corner anyone. He simply removed their best options. Suddenly, the idea of leaving peacefully looked less like weakness and more like intelligence. The men across the table recalculated. Pride was expensive. Survival was not. And the longer the silence stretched, the clearer it became that the night had already been decided, just not in the way they'd planned. By the time movement resumed, it wasn't aggressive. It was procedural. The posture of men who had accepted that the leverage they thought they had never existed. Bumpy remained still, centered, letting the room adjust itself around his certainty. That was the difference. Anyone could threaten violence. Anyone could force a moment. But forcing a resolution, one that left no appetite for retaliation, required authority that didn't need to announce itself. And in that room, authority had already spoken. It just hadn't raised its voice. When the room finally settled, what remained wasn't anger or relief, it was clarity. The kind that arrives when all alternatives have quietly disappeared. In Harlem, clarity carried weight. It didn't argue. It didn't negotiate. It simply stood there, waiting for everyone else to catch up. The man who had made the deal understood that first. Not because anyone explained it to him, but because no one needed to. The silence around him was different now. No reassurance, no familiar glances. The protection he believed he'd purchased had already expired. That's the problem with buying loyalty. It only lasts as long as the transaction feels profitable. The moment it becomes inconvenient, it vanishes. Bumpy didn't rush the ending. He never rushed endings. He let the reality sink in slowly, letting the room do most of the work for him. In that pause, the true cost of betrayal revealed itself. Not just in consequences, but in isolation. Betrayal doesn't kill you immediately. It removes your place. It strips away context, history, and witnesses willing to remember you kindly. What followed wasn't spectacle. Harlem didn't need spectacle to learn lessons. It needed consistency. The outcome matched the rule everyone already knew but rarely saw enforced so cleanly. If you trade trust for money, you don't get to choose how the balance is settled. The city didn't talk about what happened in detail. It didn't have to. The message traveled faster without specifics. After that night, things changed in subtle ways. Meetings took longer. Offers came with more caution. Outsiders stopped assuming that proximity equaled access. The idea that Harlem could be unlocked from the inside lost its appeal. Not because it was impossible, but because the cost had become unpredictable. For Bumpy Johnson, the night wasn't remembered as a victory. Victories invite challenges. It was remembered as a correction, a recalibration, the kind that doesn't provoke revenge because it leaves no confusion about cause and effect, no loose ends, no misunderstandings. The $30,000 that had started everything became irrelevant. Money was never the point. The point was demonstrating that value could not be assigned to a man without his consent. That power, when properly held, didn't need to chase repayment. It collected it naturally. Harlem absorbed the lesson the way it always did, quietly, permanently. People adjusted their expectations. Lines that had been tested were no longer approached, and the space between loyalty and betrayal widened into something unmistakable. Because in the end, the most dangerous part of selling someone out isn't what happens to them. It's what happens to you when the city decides you're no longer worth protecting. Stories like this survive because they explain something people feel but rarely articulate. Power isn't loud, it doesn't rush, it doesn't panic when a room turns against it. Real power waits, observes, and lets others expose themselves. That's why what happened that night in Harlem wasn't remembered as an act of violence. It was remembered as a correction. For Bumpy Johnson, the outcome wasn't about revenge. Revenge invites repetition. It creates cycles. What he enforced was finality. A line so clearly drawn that no one felt the need to test it again. Harlem didn't need blood in the streets to understand where authority lived. It only needed one night where every option except the right one quietly disappeared. The lesson spread without announcements. No speeches, no warnings, just a shift in behavior. Meetings became more careful. Promises became heavier. Loyalty stopped being treated as something that could be rented and started being treated as something that had to be earned and protected. That's why this story still matters. Not because of who died or who walked away, but because it shows how power operates when it's fully in control of consequences. When it doesn't need to threaten, because everyone already understands the cost of defiance. When it doesn't celebrate, because celebration signals uncertainty. Harlem remembered that night as the moment it became clear that you couldn't outmaneuver Bumpy by standing close to him. Proximity wasn't leverage. Trust wasn't currency. And betrayal, no matter how carefully packaged, always came with a price that couldn't be negotiated down. If this story resonated with you, it's because the principle still holds. In any system, criminal, political, or corporate, the people who survive longest aren't the loudest or the most aggressive. They're the ones who understand timing, perception, and consequence better than everyone else. And in Harlem, that understanding had a name: